Thank you. Good morning, students. Good morning. I suppose you can all hear me. If you cannot at any one time, let me know, okay? I don't know how this works, this gimmick. I'm not very good in electronics. I'm going to speak to you about the Holocaust. Who knows what this is all about? What does Holocaust mean? Anybody? Holocaust, really, I learned, comes from the Greek. And it means something like fiery ending. And it really refers to the death of approximately 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews. I'm talking about civilians who were killed during the Second World War. Among the non-Jews civilians were many people from countries like Poland or Yugoslavia, and civilians who did not like the regime, the Nazi regime, who opposed it. There were criminals from prisons. There were non-believers. There were political enemies and clergymen, people from all walks of life. And among the Jews, of course, there were Jews from all over Europe. And the result was the elimination of most of Europe's Jews, among them most of the members of my family. What kind of an accent do I have? Anybody? Yes? What? Russian? No? Don't? Yes? German, yeah. In Vienna, people speak German. And although I've lived here for over 60 years, I can't get rid of my accent. And maybe it doesn't surprise anybody. I was born in Vienna, and I went to public schools like you do. I had friends among Jews and non-Jews. And I lived a normal life. My family consisted of a younger sister, my immediate family, I should say, and my parents and 6 cousins and a large number of uncles and aunts and my grandparents and whatnot, with the exception of one cousin who managed to come to the United States before the war broke out, and my sister, who was able to go to England with a children's transport, also before the war broke out. I'm the only survivor. I have been talking to groups such as you, to schools, and other groups of adults for many, many years. And unfortunately, I remember these events, although they go back so many years, as if they were happening yesterday or today. Why? Because I can't forget them. There isn't a single day when I don't think back at some of these incidents. Yes, I may have exchanged some of the names. I may have been able to misidentify some of the camps, and I may not have been correct in talking about the municipalities in which I spent some time. But other than that, I can tell you, this is unfortunately the same speech I made 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, because I can't get rid of this. After I was kicked out of school at the age of 15, and the Germans marched into Austria and annexed the country, I was decorated with an item like this here that said, can you see that? Yeah? It said, Jude, Jew. And that it had to be securely fastened to sewn on each outer garment. That identified us as second-class citizen. We were not able to not only not go to school, but we were not able to go to a store except during 1 hour a day. We had to walk in the street if we met a German soldier or a policeman or somebody in uniform. And our parents lost their jobs, had their businesses taken away, and their bank accounts closed. So with one stroke, the Jews of Austria were impoverished. Pretty soon I was going to a soup kitchen, bringing home a warm meal for my family. My father became very sick. He was not treated by anybody because Jewish physicians were not allowed to practice. Non-Jewish physicians were not treating a Jew. So he soon died, and I was at that time heartbroken. But in hindsight, I couldn't have been happier that he was spared the hardship that my poor mother had to go through. In order to escape the deportations that took place from Austria to areas recently taken over in the east, like Poland, Latvia, Lithuania too. Some of the Jews were sent there in transports and never heard from again. My mother and I, again, I must say that I would have liked to see a map of Europe here, but next to Austria is another country, Hungary. My mother and I were able to escape to that country at night during the war with the help of a guide. And we were picked up in Hungary. We couldn't speak the language, and taken into a internment camp where I stayed over 2 years. I was sometimes hungry, but never mistreated. And these 2 years, of course, saved my life. In 1944, towards the end of the war already, the Germans marched into Hungary as well, although they were their allies. And I, together with about 500,000 others, Hungarian Jews, were shipped to Auschwitz, which I never heard of at that time. I never heard that word. And I want to tell you a little bit about how this happened. One day, the Jews in that camp were separated from the non-Jews. There were gypsies there and criminals and all kinds of people. But the Jews were selected, and marched out of the camp to another small little town in Hungary where we came to a railroad station that was encircled by German guards, German soldiers with guns. And in the middle, there were the Jews of the surrounding towns and villages sitting on their belongings, also not knowing what happened to them. We were marched in there with them, and I saw there was a long train brought in, a freight train consisting of closed freight cars with a large sliding door in the center and two little windows on each side, a round roof. The windows were boarded up with wooden slats, and a plank leaded up to the door in the center. We didn't know what that was for, but upon a signal, all of a sudden the soldiers drove us into these cars without saying a word, without counting or explaining. They drove all these people into these cars. And I found myself standing in one of these like herring next to each other. And when they closed the sliding door, it was pitch black in there. It took us hours to find ways so we could, one half of the car, people could sort of slide in each other's lap, and the others would sit on the floor again in each other's lap. And then we would take turns. We didn't have any food, didn't have any water. And most importantly, there were no sanitary facilities. There were men, women, children, old and young. I was told that in some cars, babies were born. In every car, people died. And to the best of my recollection, that trip took 3 days and 2 nights. It wasn't that long because I traced it afterwards. It was only a few hundred miles. But it was stop and go and stop and go. And in all this time, nobody came to open the doors. Nobody came to offer us a drink, a glass of water, some fresh air. We were like cattle. After what seemed like an eternity to me, I could hear that we must have arrived at the end station because I heard them open some of the sliding doors. And pretty soon, somebody opened the door for our car too. And I was standing pretty much in the front. And I looked out, and I saw that we must have arrived at a large railroad station. There were several sidings, and similar trains must have arrived there. There were thousands of people milling around, civilians, some of them with funny-looking gray and blue striped pajama-type uniforms, others soldiers with guns. And pretty soon we were ordered out of these cars, and those that could jumped down, the others were thrown out, and we had to separate men from women and line up in rows of 5s. And I stood there slowly, moving forward, looking around, And I realized we had arrived at a huge railroad station. It was summer, or at least spring, and warm and sunny. But the sun didn't seem to shine as bright as I remembered it. It seemed to be a cloud in the air. And something else I noticed, a terrible stench. Slowly, slowly we progressed until I found myself opposite a very elegant officer uniform. He had a riding whip in his hand. And with that whip, he was indicating either left or right, whichever direction he pointed, that prisoner was pushed, and we had again line up in rows of fives. Pretty soon we were marched away, men only in our group, of course, to a wooded area with walkways and guard towers with guards in it, and along some peaceful area, I remembered, with yellow flowers, and it was so peaceful, it was unbelievable after all that terrible train trip. And in one of the rows before me, there was a tall man who probably knew where he was. He turned around and walked into the grass, into the flowers, slowly. The guards yelled, "Stop, stop!" But he wouldn't stop. Then the guards gave a signal, and one of the towers opened up with a few shots and a few bursts from a machine gun, and the man dropped dead. They pointed. 2 men had to go in there, drag the man out, and pull him along. The whole thing didn't take more than 2 minutes. And we came to a barracks where we had to get undressed completely, separate all our belongings, empty our pockets, take off our eyeglasses if we had any, our watches, our rings, everything came in separate containers. And then we were shorn on our heads. At that time, I had hair, and we were shorn to about maybe an inch and a half across our head. Only in the center we had a 2-inch maybe strip down to the skin, the scalp. We looked like, I don't know, something out of a funny strip, or like out of the zoo. Then we were rushed into another barracks shower, in a cold shower. We stood outside until we were for hours and hours, and then we were rushed to another barracks where they each threw one of these tops, gray and blue striped tops, and a pair of pants at us. And each one had a pair of shoes thrown at them too. Without size, without asking whether you're tall or short or fat or thing, each one got a piece of clothing. No underwear, no socks, no nothing, no handkerchief, no pencil, no pen. We were reduced to the very basic that human beings can exist with. This was the beginning of about 1 year of slave labor for me. What about my mother, who I learned came with a similar transport a few weeks later to the same place. She too was marched into one of these barracks, told to undress, to strip, to keep their belongings here and there and separated. And she too was marched with the others into a barracks where there were shower heads overhead. But instead of water, Cyclone B gas came out. And after a few minutes of terrible suffering, she died, together with thousands and thousands and thousands of others. Then special commandos of prisoners came and took these bodies to another place, the crematorium, where the bodies were burned. Only at that time, when I and also my mother came, there were so many people arriving every day that, of course, the facilities could not handle all these thousands and thousands of bodies. So most of them were put into great big pits and burned. And the smell and the smoke and the clouds that I had noticed when I first came to Auschwitz was what was left of the bodies being cremated in the open. I could stand here probably for hours and tell you what happened to me next. But suffice it to say that I worked for about a year on street buildings, road building in Germany at a very minimum of food and at the maximum of labor. Not too many survived it. I was 21 years at that age, and I must have been strong enough to be able to survive it. Most of the soldiers, our guards, were cruel, but some of them did not follow the rule. Even among the special SS, there were some that either saw the handwriting on the wall or felt some remorse. I remember one day we were called. We worked, by the way, we worked 6 days a week, in a week, and the 7th day on Sunday we did not work, but more people died on Sundays because the SS made us, SS was the special military units that formed the guards. They had their fun with us, and they made us do exercises and shot or killed us in any way if we didn't obey. So anyway, some of them showed signs of pity. I remember once we were called to stand in our camps for hours while 2 men were hanged, which was a procedure seldom followed. People were usually killed by a shot, but these were hanged to make an example out of it. And after a while, I found out why. They had signed a letter written by some guards that if they should fall into the hands of allies, these people did not mistreat me, and it's signed by these 2 prisoners. Some people tried to save their own lives among the guards because German troops were retreating on all fronts at that time. I also remember one of the guards calling me one day at the work where we worked on the road and said to me, "Go behind that shrub over there and see what I brought for you." And you know, our food was such that the average life expectancy was no more than a few months. And every month, hundreds of people came in to replenish the prisoners in our camp so that we could continue with our work. So I went behind that shrub and I saw a little package on the floor. I opened the package and there was a piece of poppy seed cake. I couldn't believe my eyes. And I ate that poppy seed cake. I hadn't seen anything like this for such a long time. I didn't know what to think. But it was an indication that some people did not share the feelings of some of the others, were not as cruel. So this happened more than 60 years ago. And to this day, poppy seed is one of my favorite desserts, poppy seed cake. When the Russian front came closer and closer to our camp, we were evacuated from there, the first ones, the most precious cargo, and marched out first on foot and then in winter by open freight trains, similar to the first one, only open. And people without food, people died standing in these open cars. They didn't even fall over because we were standing next to each other like herrings. I remember we went through a good part of Germany and part of Czechoslovakia at that time. And I remember especially one city called Dresden. I don't know whether you ever heard of that, where American and British bombers obliterated the city almost completely. And our train was going on freshly laid rails across the surrounding areas of that city. And I saw a city like I had never seen before. Completely turned into rubble. And when I thought how many of these innocent people must have died there, I was happy for the first time as a prisoner. Can you imagine how one individual can be happy when looking at the misery of others? But that was how I felt at that time. After the war, I found out that over 40,000 people died there in 2 days of bombing. I ended up in another camp called Bergen-Belsen, and I want to tell you a little bit about that, because we did not receive any food there at all anymore. The war seemed to come to an end. There were constant air raids. SS ran away. There were fewer and fewer guards. And one day, I woke up. I couldn't walk anymore. I was just dragging myself on the floor. But I got outside and I saw the tanks were of a different color. The soldiers had a different uniform. They were speaking English. And I knew I was free. I was liberated. Otherwise, the dying continued. There were thousands and thousands of bodies laying around. And a friend of mine shared a cot. And this friend of mine was stronger. He could walk, and he went with others, to the kitchen where they had some food, and they prepared food for the soldiers, for the guards too. And he came back with a little paper bag with flour, the first food in I don't know how many days. So how should we eat that? How should we prepare it? We each had a metal dish, and this friend of mine went to the pond that consisted, in the middle of the camp was a little pond, slimy, dirty, stinking water that consisted of our only water supply. He brought some water in that metal dish of his. We poured the flour in it, took a spoon and mixed it up. And then I asked one of the British soldiers for a match, and we took some of the straw from the straw sacks and put it on the few stones and lit it, and put the metal dish on top and stirred it. The water, of course, never boiled, but it became warm. And that was my first meal after liberation. To this day, I think it tasted like glue more than like food. But that was the first meal I had. The next day, I got a Red Cross package from the soldiers. And there were some wonderful things in there. There were canned meats and dry toast and soap and toilet tissue and things that I hadn't seen for a year or more. I was so weak and so tired that I took out some of the toast bread from the package and was chewing on it. And I was so exhausted from the events of the day, I crawled on my cot and took the package as a pillow under my head, and I fell asleep. And when I woke up, the package was gone, and the only thing I found was it fell out a can of milk. So I took that can of milk and I dragged myself out to the street, and I found a nail, and I took a stone and I began to hammer on that can of milk, trying to open it. And I didn't have the strength to open the can of milk. And I looked around, and there was nothing changed. There was nothing changed. People were dying. There were thousands of bodies laying around. And the tanks had a different color, and the soldiers a different uniform, but the dead and the dying went on. And I was so weak I couldn't even open a can of milk. I did something that I hadn't done for years. I began to cry. I was sitting there crying when an English soldier came by and saw me there and asked me whether he could help me. But I just shook my head. But then I remembered my sister was in England, and I remember the name of the city where she was, a small town called Luton. So I asked the soldier whether there was anybody from Luton in his outfit. And he looked at me like I was crazy. And then he says, "Don't go away, I'll be right back." But it must have sounded to him like this guy is nuts, because almost like if somebody, I don't know, strangers meet in the middle of Sahara, of the desert, and one says, "Say, aren't you from Weisel?" So soon enough he came back and he looked for me, and he came back with a nurse and an officer. And the nurse came up to me and she says, "Why do you want to know about Luton?" I said, "Because my sister is there, my sister is there." So she took down my sister's name and said she was going to go on furlough pretty soon and tell my sister that I have been liberated. And the officer told me that he was a physician. He was going to try and save me. And he picked me up and carried me to an empty barracks and brought a large container of black tea and a container of zwieback, dry toast, and said to me, "That's all you're gonna eat or drink." And for 3 days I was in that cot. He came and fed me. He cleaned me up. I was swarming with lice. He hadn't seen a piece of soap for a year. I was filthy. I stank to heaven. He saved my life. And this is what I wanted to tell you, that people can exist under circumstances that are difficult to describe, difficult to believe. And yet I was able to recover, came to Sweden on a stretcher, where I stayed over 2 years and was nursed back to health. I am telling you this story because I believe that young people like you should still know how low we human beings can sink, what we are able to do to each other. And yet, we must always remember that not all the Germans were bad any more than all the Jews were good, or anybody else. And I want to ask you something right now, whether any of you thinks that he or she is prejudiced. Are you prejudiced? Truth. Yes. Are you prejudiced? Yeah? Sometimes. How about you? Yeah? You're not. And you? Sometimes. I'll tell you something. I think we all are prejudiced sometimes. I am prejudiced. But I fight it day and night. Day and night. And the main objective of my little talk to you is that we must never, ever judge a person by the way they look, by the way they are dressed, by the color of the skin, but by what? By this here, not this here, this here, and this here. Do you know what I mean? All right. If you have gotten this, then I think I was successful in my little speech. I would like you to ask some questions if you have time. I don't know. We have 10 minutes. I could show the map. Would you like to see the map? Well, maybe, yeah, if they have questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Anybody?
I know. You know, Miss Price came in. We got a camera here. In fact, she wants to get some pictures of you. But you know, she said, you know, what's striking about Mr. Barron, he's still got a smile on his face, going through this. And you know, I mean, how many of you would be bitter if someone murdered your mother? I'm telling you, I'd go crazy. And yet, Mr. Barron has got the ability to smile yet and have a sense of humor. What, you know, what? How does a person overcome these things?
Well, you know, it leaves, there's no doubt, it leaves deep scars in survivors. And it leaves, unfortunately, scars in the second generation, too. But to a large degree, people have the ability to adjust to their surroundings, to their fellow men and human beings, and become, quote unquote, normal. But deep down, unfortunately, many of our friends that came from similar backgrounds are deeply affected, like I am, and my wife is too. And I'm sure that our children suffer from this, although we never talk to them about that. And the only time my children heard about it was from a similar background when they were in school and I was asked to talk about it. The same with my grandchildren. Hillary Clinton said a long time ago, and she was talking about raising her kids, that it takes, not her kids, kids, it takes a village. Maybe you heard that expression. We didn't have a village. So in some extent, our children are suffering from that too. But I would like to know whether you have any questions. Anything that I can answer you or try to? Yes?
Why did you choose to come?
I'm sorry?
Why did you choose to come to America?
I didn't understand.
Why did you choose to come to America?
Why do?
Why did you choose to come to the United States? How did it help?
Why did I come out to the United States? I was in Sweden, and I was telling Mr. Honig's about that, as a matter of fact, just a couple hours ago. I was in Sweden, taken from the camp where I was liberated to Sweden, together with about 30,000 others. We came to hospitals and had surgery and got back my strength and even a job. And I didn't want to come to the United States, but I wanted to leave Europe. I had Europe up to here. So I decided to come to the United States because some friends of my parents recognized my name on a survivors list that came to Sweden. And they asked me whether I want to come to the United States. So as I explained to you, I didn't have any great desire to come to the United States, but I wanted to leave Europe for sure. And I came to the United States. I came to New York first. I didn't like it. I was ready to go back to Sweden. And somebody told me, you know, there's more to the United States than just New York City. There is a place called Minnesota, where there are lots of Swedes and Scandinavians. That's the reason I'm here. Any other questions?
Were you reunited with your sister at all?
Yes. As a matter of fact, before I came to the United States from Sweden, I stopped in England, and I was staying with my sister for a couple of weeks. And before that, she came to Sweden to visit me. She told me that this nurse that saw me in the camp in Bergen-Belsen found her in Luton in England and told her that I was liberated by British troops, but I was in such poor condition that she shouldn't have any hope I would survive. Any other questions? Well, my friends, I hope that you have learned something from my miserable story, and I hope that you have a good day, a good week ahead, and better experiences than what I had to describe to you. Thank you for your presence.